Hello, my dear friends. My name is Jane, and tonight I'm delighted to welcome you to another mystery. This one is titled Death at the Old Railway Station. Picture a crisp autumn evening in the village, the leaves drifting outside while we sit together by the fire, a pot of tea steaming on the table. It's the perfect setting for secrets and whispers. Now, I wonder, have you ever walked past an old station and felt it held a story of its own? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's step quietly into the mystery together. The evening had drawn its veil of crisp autumn air over St. Mary Mead, that most unassuming of English villages. Golden lamplight glowed softly from cottage windows, spilling across cobbled lanes where the hush of fallen leaves whispered beneath careful steps. Church bells, distant and mellow, marked the hour with reassuring dignity. And yet, beneath this calm surface, a subtle suspense lingered, as though the night itself held its breath. Beyond the village green lay the old railway station, long abandoned, ivy-clad, and avoided by most. There, a lone figure hurried past, something bulky hidden beneath his coat. Inside her neat little cottage at the end of the lane, Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly by the crackling fire. The flames danced against the polished grate, sending golden flickers across her bookshelves and the framed samplers that lined her sitting room. She had her knitting needles in hand, though her mind, as so often, was far from idle. Outside, the village lay hushed in the cool embrace of autumn, yet within, the room carried a snug tranquillity, the faint tick of the clock, the scent of wood smoke, and the occasional pop of a log surrendering to the fire. It was at such moments, when St. Mary Mead seemed most serene, that curious events had a way of intruding. Indeed, Miss Marple often reflected that human nature rarely kept still for long, even in the quietest of parishes. And as if summoned by that very thought, a brisk knock sounded upon her door. "Good evening, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Price Ridley, bustling in without waiting for invitation, cheeks pink from the chill. She removed her gloves with unnecessary drama and lowered herself into the nearest chair. "I do hope I don't intrude, but I thought you ought to know. Something's afoot near the old railway station." Miss Marple set her knitting aside with a gentle smile. "The station, dear? That's not a place one often hears about these days." Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward, her eyes alight with the relish of village gossip. "I was passing there not half an hour ago, taking a short cut, you know, and I'm certain I heard a scream. A dreadful sound it was, sharp and sudden, and not the sort of thing one mistakes." Miss Marple, ever composed, merely nodded. She poured her guest a cup of tea from the pot already warming at her side. People do sometimes imagine things, especially in the dusk. But then, one must always allow for the possibility that they do not. Encouraged, Mrs. Price Ridley went on, her voice hushed though no one else was near. "And I could swear I saw a man slip through the trees. A stranger, not one of ours, carrying something close to his chest. It put me quite out of spirits." The old lady's sharp blue eyes rested kindly on her visitor, yet behind them her thoughts worked swiftly, drawing delicate threads together. A scream. A stranger. The station. These were not ordinary matters, however much they might later be dismissed as fancy. "You did quite right to mention it," she said at last. "The smallest details can prove most revealing. One never knows, after all, how seemingly trifling things may connect." Mrs. Price Ridley sipped her tea, clearly reassured. The fire crackled on, but the stillness of the room felt subtly altered, as if carrying the echo of unseen footsteps. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. Outside, the night deepened, and somewhere beyond the village green, the shadows near the station seemed to grow darker still. Morning in St. Mary Mead always arrived with a certain unhurried dignity, as though the village itself disliked being roused too abruptly. A faint mist lingered in the hedgerows, dissolving as the first rays of sunlight touched the rooftops. The baker's shop was already alive with the warm scent of fresh loaves, and the bell above the post office door jingled as the earliest patrons collected their letters. Somewhere, a cockerel crowed rather belatedly, as if embarrassed to have overslept. Miss Marple stepped out into the crisp air, a small basket on her arm, intending to purchase milk and perhaps a seed cake should there be any left at the bakery. She paused a moment to admire the blaze of autumn colours along the lane, russet leaves drifting gently to the ground, their quiet rustle mingling with the distant sound of a milk cart. St. Mary Mead looked as charming as a painted postcard, every cottage neat, every garden carefully tended. Yet beneath the picture-book prettiness lay a subtle murmur of disquiet. Neighbours stood in twos and threes at gates and doorsteps, their voices lowered yet tinged with urgency. Miss Marple, with her accustomed unobtrusiveness, caught fragments of talk as she passed. "They say someone screamed." "A figure hurrying past in the dark." "And at the old station, of all places, why there?" The station itself, long closed and given over to ivy and bramble, was rarely mentioned in village gossip. It stood at the edge of the parish like a forgotten relic, its windows blank and its once busy platform now a haunt of pigeons. That it should suddenly become the subject of chatter lent the morning a curious, unsettled air. At the bakery, Miss Marple received her loaf wrapped in brown paper from young Mr. Lisson, who looked unusually animated. "Strange goings, and, miss," he confided, lowering his voice. "My cousin swears he saw a light moving in the station-house late last night. Lantern-like," he said. "But who'd be there? No one has reason." Miss Marple gave a mild smile, the kind that invited more without betraying too much of her own thoughts. "Perhaps a trick of the eyes," she suggested gently, though inwardly she filed the remark alongside Mrs. Price Ridley's tale of the scream and the stranger. Lanterns, after all, did not appear of their own accord. The village postmistress, encountered just outside, was equally brimming with news. "A letter's gone missing, or so Mrs. Finch insists," she said indignantly. "She swears she posted it, yet her sister never received it. I shouldn't wonder if these odd happenings are all of a piece. There's mischief about, you mark my words." Miss Marple merely nodded, her expression polite, but her mind ticked quietly onward. Letters mislaid, lights where none should be, whispers of strangers. Each might be no more than coincidence, but in her long experience, coincidences rarely remained so for long. And then, carried faintly on the morning air, came the shrill, unmistakable sound of a railway whistle. Miss Marple froze for a fraction of a second, though no one else seemed to notice. The station had been closed for years. No train had passed that way in a decade or more. Yet the echo lingered, sharp and disquieting, as though the village itself had heard a ghost. The old railway station lay in its customary hush, its once busy platform choked with weeds and ivy curling thickly around rusting rails. It was the sort of place children both feared and adored, fearful in its shadows, yet irresistible in its promise of hidden adventures. That morning, two village boys, Peter and Geoffrey, set out to test their courage, as boys so often do. Armed with sticks and boundless curiosity, they crept past the no trespassing sign that had long since lost its authority. "Bet you won't climb the signal post," Geoffrey dared, his breath puffing white in the cool air. Peter, determined not to appear cowardly, strode ahead towards the platform. Yet before he could issue his retort, he stumbled, his stick clattering to the ground. There, half concealed by a tangle of ivy and fallen timbers, lay the unmistakable form of a man. For a moment the boys froze, their bravado dissolving like morning mist. The figure was strangely still, one arm crooked unnaturally, the face turned away. A hat lay discarded a few feet off, and in the man's clenched hand was a scrap of paper, its edges torn and muddied. Peter swallowed hard. Geoffrey, his not moving. Their voices, thin and trembling, carried across the empty station. Suddenly the thrill of daring seemed foolish, and the adventure turned dreadful. Without another word, the boys bolted back along the path, shouting for help with every ounce of breath. By the time the alarm reached the heart of St. Mary Mead, a small procession had already formed, villagers eager to see for themselves what the boys had found. Curiosity, after all, was as abundant in the parish as blackberries in hedgerow. They gathered at the platform's edge, their whispers quick and urgent, until Inspector Graves himself arrived, brisk and purposeful, notebook in hand. Miss Marple, though not one to seek a spectacle, appeared with the quiet inevitability of one who always finds herself where she is most needed. She stood a little apart, her eyes keen beneath the brim of her hat, observing the way villagers clutched their coats tighter, how Mrs. Price Ridley craned her neck far more eagerly than propriety allowed. The inspector crouched beside the body, muttering under his breath as he noted the clothing, well-tailored but a trifle old-fashioned, as though the stranger belonged to another time. The parchment scrap was carefully pried from the stiff fingers. Though muddied and torn, a few words were still legible: rights of property, to be delivered. Legal business of some sort, Inspector Graves announced, though his tone suggested disinterest. Some tramp or vagrant, no doubt caught in misadventure. But Miss Marple's sharp gaze lingered on the man's shoes, polished, though scuffed by recent travel, and the faint mark on his cuff that might once have borne a crest. Hardly the attire of a vagrant. She said nothing, merely filed the detail away with the quiet precision of one long accustomed to the foibles of human nature. And as the body was lifted with solemn care, a chill seemed to settle over the station. The pigeons stirred, wings fluttering against the rafters, as though even they sensed that St. Mary Mead's quiet order had been disturbed. Inspector Graves was not a man given to dramatics. Solid in build, with iron-grey hair brushed neatly back and a moustache trimmed to military precision, he had built his career on the conviction that most crimes were pedestrian matters, petty thefts, jealous quarrels, and the occasional burglary botched in haste. His arrival in St. Mary Mead that morning, however, was anything but ordinary. The villagers, clustered at the station gates, made way as he passed, their whispers buzzing like bees disturbed from a hive. Graves surveyed the scene with brisk efficiency, casting a glance at the abandoned platform, the body already removed to a waiting cart, and the gaggle of eager faces turned towards him. "Now then," he began in a voice that carried authority, "I shall need everyone's statements, in turn and without embellishment." A ripple of amusement passed through the onlookers. Without embellishment was hardly a phrase that suited St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Price Ridley pressed forward eagerly. "Inspector, I can assure you I heard a scream last night, sharp as anything, and I saw a man, positively saw him, hurrying along with a bundle. Of course, I thought nothing at the time." "Names, madam," Graves interrupted, pencil poised. "Descriptions. Facts." She pursed her lips, somewhat deflated, and offered little more than vague shadows. Others fared no better. Mr. Ellison from the bakery insisted he had glimpsed a lantern in the station, while Mrs. Finch from the post office was adamant that her missing letter must have been stolen by the dead man himself. Each tale grew more embroidered than the last, coloured by personal grievances and the relish of being involved in something important. All the while, Miss Marple lingered at the edge of the group, silent, her eyes half hidden beneath her neat little hat. She noted how quickly Mrs. Price Ridley claimed the spotlight, how Mr. Ellison's excitement lent him confidence, and how Mrs. Finch's complaint bore the sharpness of long habit. Human nature, she thought, is a tapestry that unravels if you tug gently at the right thread. When at last the inspector turned to her, his manner softened with the respect due to age. "And you, Miss Marple, did you hear or see anything unusual?" She shook her head mildly. "Nothing more than what has already been mentioned, Inspector. Only that I find it curious the poor gentleman was so well dressed." "A vagrant, you suggested?" "But his shoes were polished, and his cuff bore the faintest impression of a crest. Perhaps not a tramp at all." Graves frowned, jotting something down, though his expression suggested he placed little weight on her observation. "An outsider's business," he muttered, closing his notebook with a snap. "Little to do with the village itself. Likely a matter from London or elsewhere. We'll soon have it sorted." Yet Miss Marple, with the faintest crease at the corner of her eyes, thought otherwise. Villages, in her long experience, were never so innocent as they appeared. Outsiders might arrive, but it was the insiders, their secrets, their rivalries, their quiet ambitions, that so often held the key. And as the inspector strode away, the villagers trailing behind in a flurry of speculation, Miss Marple stood quietly a moment longer. The autumn wind rustled through the ivy along the station wall, carrying with it the uneasy sense that this mystery was only just beginning. If there was one event that never failed to draw the entirety of St. Mary Mead from their cottages, it was the annual harvest festival. The church bells rang cheerfully that afternoon, calling villagers to the square where stalls had been set up beneath fluttering bunting. Pumpkins gleamed like lanterns, baskets overflowed with apples and pears, and the air smelled warmly of roasting chestnuts and mulled cider. Children darted between tables laden with jams and honey, their laughter carrying above the chatter of neighbours exchanging greetings. Miss Marple walked slowly along the gravel path, pausing to admire the vicar's wife's arrangement of dahlias, which had already won a blue ribbon. Her eyes twinkled kindly as she offered congratulations, yet her mind, ever alert, measured the undercurrent of tension that seemed to ripple beneath the merriment. For though the day was bright, the talk was tinged with shadow. Whispers of the dead man at the station found their way into nearly every conversation. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a new autumn coat, leaned close as Miss Marple examined a display of jams. "My dear, it's positively thrilling, isn't it? A body, right here in St. Mary Mead. One doesn't like to admit it, but there's a certain excitement in it all. I cannot imagine what brought the poor fellow to such an end." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully, her fingers resting lightly on a jar of blackberry preserve. "Human nature often brings people where one least expects them," she said softly. At the far side of the square, a group of villagers gathered around a fiddler, the cheerful notes of a reel filling the air. And yet, amidst the gaiety, Miss Marple noticed small peculiarities. Mr. Ellison from the bakery, who was usually all good humour, kept glancing over his shoulder as though fearing someone might be watching him. Young Geoffrey, one of the boys who had discovered the body, lingered near the cider stall, pale and subdued, refusing to meet the eyes of those who pressed him for tales of the discovery. It was then that Miss Marple's sharp ears caught a fragment of conversation carried on the breeze. Two women, their heads bent close together near the apple stall, whispered in tones of urgency. "It must never be found," one said, her voice trembling. The word struck Miss Marple like a pebble dropped into still water, sending rings of speculation outward in her mind. What was this it that must remain hidden? Was it connected to the stranger's death, or some smaller village secret that chance had entwined with larger matters? She did not betray that she had overheard, merely continued her unhurried walk, greeting the blacksmith's wife here, the schoolmistress there. But her thoughts remained sharp, her memory storing each detail with the precision of one who had learned long ago that truth often lay in the things people tried hardest to conceal. And as the daylight waned, lanterns were lit around the square, casting a golden glow over the merriment. Yet for Miss Marple, the shadows seemed to lengthen, wrapping themselves more tightly about the mystery that had begun to unfurl in St. Mary Mead. Few things in St. Mary Mead were as certain as Mrs. Bantry's afternoon tea. Her drawing-room, with its floral wallpaper and overstuffed armchairs, was a haven of warmth, especially on an autumn day when the wind rattled at the panes and the fire burned cheerfully in the grate. On the low table before her, a sponge cake, dusted with sugar, sat proudly beside a plate of delicate sandwiches. A silver pot of tea steamed invitingly, filling the room with its fragrant promise of comfort. Miss Marple, having accepted the invitation with her usual grace, settled into her chair and folded her hands neatly in her lap. She looked the picture of serenity, though her eyes missed nothing. The way Mrs. Bantry fussed with the cake knife a moment longer than necessary, the quick, eager gleam in her friend's eyes. Gossip was coming. Miss Marple could sense it as surely as she could smell the lavender polish on the sideboard. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry began, pouring out the tea with a flourish, "I simply must tell you, though of course it is all in strictest confidence, that the stranger found at the station, well, it seems he was no stranger at all." Miss Marple raised her brows, her tone mild. "Indeed. That is very interesting." "Oh yes. Mrs. Price Ridley swears she saw him in the company of Mr. Ellison only a fortnight ago, at the very edge of the common. Though of course Mr. Ellison denies it furiously." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, watching the ripples in the cup. Denial is often very firm when truth might prove inconvenient. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And that's not all. Old Dr. Haydock told my husband, quite offhand, of course, that the poor man had bruises on his wrists. Bruises! As though he had been bound. Can you imagine? Here, in St. Mary Mead. The crackle of the fire filled the pause, as though the hearth itself considered the weight of such words. Miss Marple, however, only sipped her tea calmly. One mustn't leap to conclusions, Dolly. Bruises may come from many things. But I grant you, it is suggestive. Outside, a gust of wind sent dry leaves skittering across the lawn, a rustle like whispers against the window panes. Inside, the cosy room felt almost too warm, the contrast between comfort and the dark hints of mystery drawing both women into a deeper silence. At last, Mrs. Bantry shook herself and reached for the cake. "Well, if there is wickedness afoot, I dare say you'll see through it before any of us, Jane. You always do. I only hope the police will listen for once." Miss Marple smiled, modest and serene. "The police have their methods, and very good ones too. But sometimes, I fear, it is the smallest things, the angle of a look, the tone of a voice, that reveal more than fingerprints ever could." She set down her cup with delicate precision. Already, the pieces of a puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in her mind, and she suspected that before long, St. Mary Mead's cosy veneer would be tested in ways its inhabitants could scarcely imagine. Sunday morning arrived with the sort of brisk clarity that autumn often brought to St. Mary Mead. The church bells rang out across the village, their tones mingling with the distant caw of rooks and the faint whistle of the wind through the hedgerows. Villagers, wrapped in coats and scarves, made their way along the winding lanes toward the stone church, its spire rising proudly above the tiled roofs and crimson ivy. Inside, the atmosphere was at once solemn and familiar. Polished pews, the scent of beeswax and hymnals, and the soft glow of morning light filtering through stained glass. Miss Marple, ever punctual, had chosen her seat with care, close enough to hear every word, yet sufficiently unobtrusive to observe the congregation. For to her, Sunday service was not merely a spiritual exercise, it was also a study in human nature. The vicar, a kindly man with thinning hair and a voice prone to wandering from gentle rumble to sudden fervour, took his place at the pulpit. He opened with a homily on honesty and the peril of concealed sins, his words echoing with more weight than usual. "For," he intoned, "there is nothing hidden that shall not be revealed, nothing covered that shall not be made known." A stirring passage indeed, but what interested Miss Marple was not the sermon itself, but the effect it had on those listening. Mrs. Price Ridley sat bolt upright, lips pursed tightly, her eyes flickering toward Mr. Ellison with unmistakable reproach. Mr. Ellison, for his part, fidgeted in his seat, his gaze fixed determinedly on the hymn-board as though it held the secrets of the universe. Then there was young Lily, the station-master's niece, who seemed unusually pale. She twisted her handkerchief with nervous fingers, lowering her eyes whenever the vicar spoke of transgressions in one's midst. The girl's distress was subtle, but not invisible, not to Miss Marple, whose gentle, unassuming gaze missed little. The sermon continued, the vicar urging his flock to seek truth and reconciliation, to cast aside falsehood and speak plainly. His words lingered in the air, resonant, as though tailored to the strange unease that had settled over the village since the discovery at the railway station. When the final hymn rose, voices joining in a wavering yet earnest harmony, Miss Marple observed still more. Mrs. Bantry sang with vigour, casting curious glances at the younger folk. Colonel Melchay, the magistrate, looked stern and distracted, his jaw set in determination. And near the back, a man she had not seen before sat quietly, his hat pulled low as though to conceal his face. The service ended, the organ's last notes fading into silence. People began to file out, their Sunday greetings polite but subdued, like villagers half prepared for gossip to burst forth once they crossed the churchyard gate. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer, her hands folded, her eyes thoughtful. The vicar's sermon had been about divine truth, but human truths, those small, telltale betrayals of conscience, were already whispering around her. She rose at last, certain that something, or someone, had shifted within those stone walls that morning. The congregation spilled from the church into the crisp autumn air, the churchyard bathed in a soft golden light. Gravestones leaned at angles against carpets of fallen leaves, and the scent of damp earth mingled with wood smoke from nearby cottages. Bells still echoed faintly in the distance as parishioners gathered in little knots, exchanging polite greetings that soon turned into murmured confidences. It was always thus in St. Mary Mead. The service itself might be solemn, but the churchyard afterward was a stage for chatter, speculation, and the occasional sharp word disguised as civility. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to waste an opportunity for pronouncement, leaned heavily on her walking stick as she declared, "Mark my words, this business at the railway station is bound to be worse than anyone suspects. A man found dead in such a place. Well, nothing respectable ever comes of trains or their stations." She said it with the authority of one who had never actually boarded a train in her life. Beside her, Miss Hartnell gave a sniff of agreement. "And what's more," she added, "they say the poor fellow had no papers on him. No identification at all. Strikes me as highly suspicious. You can't help but wonder what sort of man he was, wandering about unaccounted for." Colonel Melchay, overhearing, muttered something about letting the authorities manage and not jumping to conclusions. But his firm tone only made the ladies lean closer together, their voices dropping to conspiratorial whispers. Miss Marple, moving slowly down the church path with the aid of her little black umbrella, paused now and then to smile politely, her ears, sharp as any sparrow's, catching every murmur. She noted how Mr. Ellison avoided lingering, striding out of the gate with unusual haste, while Lily, the stationmaster's niece, hung back, eyes darting nervously at each group as though terrified her name might be spoken. At another cluster, Mrs. Bantry, warm and excitable, was holding forth. "My husband says the inspector believes it to be an accident. An unfortunate gentleman stumbling onto the tracks. But I don't see it. Who carries on in such a manner, losing one's life in an abandoned station of all places? No, there's more to it. I feel it in my bones." Several nodded gravely, though Miss Weatherby, who had a fondness for romantic speculation, added breathlessly, "Perhaps it was a secret rendezvous. A meeting gone wrong. One reads of such things in novels." Miss Marple kept her expression mild, though inwardly she weighed each remark. Gossip, in her experience, was like embroidery. The pattern might be exaggerated, but the thread of truth was always present somewhere. As the villagers drifted toward the Lych gate, conversations dwindled into guarded silence. Yet the undercurrent of unease lingered, a quiet crackle of suspicion in the cool morning air. Miss Marple, the last to leave, cast one final look back at the ivy-draped church. Within its hallowed walls truths had stirred. Outside, in the chatter among gravestones, suspicions had been planted like seeds. And seeds, she knew, had a way of growing. The Monday following the churchyard gossip dawned pale and cool, the mist still clinging low over the hedgerows as if reluctant to be chased away. Villagers were only just stirring, shutters creaking open, kettles hissing faintly in cottages, when a sight most unusual disturbed the familiar rhythm of St. Mary Mead. Down the narrow lane that led toward the inn came a stranger, his tall figure cutting a curious silhouette against the fading fog. He was smartly dressed, though his coat bore the creases of a long journey. A hat was pulled low over his brow, and in one hand he carried a small leather case. His tread was purposeful, yet his eyes darted this way and that, taking in the village with a sharpness that suggested neither admiration nor ease, but a searching intent. By the time he reached the square, tongues were already wagging. From behind the counter at the grocer's, Mr. Pritchard adjusted his spectacles and nudged his wife. "Now who do you suppose that is, coming along like he owns the place?" Mrs. Pritchard replied with a sniff, "Not from around here, I can tell you that much. And arriving just when all this business with the station is at its height, it can't be coincidence." At the post office, Miss Hartnell craned her neck shamelessly through the window, while young Tommy Briggs, delivering milk, nearly tripped over his own bicycle trying to get a better look. It was at the inn, the Blue Boar, that the stranger at last paused. He removed his hat, revealing a face not easily read, features weathered by travel, a gaze that suggested calculation rather than candour. Introducing himself as Mr. Arkwright, he requested a room for an indefinite stay. Mrs. Finch, the landlady, accepted his money with brisk politeness but wasted no time hurrying to the back, where her husband was polishing tankards. "A London gentleman, by the sound of him," she whispered, "and with questions on his tongue before I'd even given him his key. Mark me, he'll stir up talk." And stir he did. Before the afternoon was out, the village was abuzz. Who was this Mr. Arkwright, and what had brought him to St. Mary Mead of all places? Some swore he was an inspector in plain clothes. Others insisted he must be a relative of the poor man found dead at the station. Miss Weatherby, ever romantic, fancied him a secret agent. Miss Marple, watching discreetly from her garden gate as he passed by, noted the quickness with which his gaze lingered on the path leading toward the abandoned station. Not the idle curiosity of a visitor, she thought, but something more directed, more knowing. She allowed herself a small sigh. Strangers rarely arrived in St. Mary Mead without cause. And when they did, cause often meant trouble. There are certain men who carry the past with them like an old overcoat, heavy, worn, and impossible to set aside. Such a man was Mr. Josiah Price, the former station-master of St. Mary Mead's once bustling railway stop. Now retired, he lived in a modest ivy-covered cottage not far from the edge of the village, where the faint echo of passing trains could still be heard on windy nights. On that particular afternoon, he was found settled by his fire, pipe in hand, when Miss Marple, under the gentle pretext of delivering a jar of quince jelly, paid him a visit. He welcomed her with stiff courtesy, though his eyes, pale and watery, betrayed a flicker of unease. "You'll forgive me, Miss Marple," he said, motioning her to a chair. "I'm not much for visitors these days." "Quite understandable, Mr. Price," Miss Marple replied with her usual mildness. "These autumn evenings do call for quiet company, though. And I was just passing by." She set the jar on the small table beside him, where it caught the glow of the firelight. They exchanged pleasantries about the weather, the dwindling rose season, and the early arrival of frost. Yet it was not long before the conversation, as Miss Marple knew it would, drifted toward the railway. "Strange, isn't it," she mused softly, "how the old station still draws whispers, even after so many years of silence. People do say that places remember things." At this, Mr. Price shifted in his chair. He tapped the bowl of his pipe, though it was not yet empty, and avoided her gaze. "Idle talk," he muttered. "Nothing more." But Miss Marple, who had seen more secrets teased from such mutterings than most policemen managed in their whole careers, simply folded her hands in her lap and waited. Silence, after all, was a most useful tool. At last, with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his bones, the old man leaned forward. "There were things that never came to light," he said quietly. "Things best left where they are." Miss Marple inclined her head just so. "Ah. But secrets, I find, have a way of slipping through cracks. And sometimes they can cause more harm when kept than when told." Price's voice dropped to a whisper. "There was a quarrel, you see, the very night before the station closed. Heated words in the waiting room, late, after the last train had gone. I heard them myself, though I pretended not to. And afterward, there was a scream." He stopped abruptly, as if startled by his own confession. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the silence. "A scream?" Miss Marple repeated, her voice calm, though her eyes sharpened. Price nodded once. "I told no one. Thought it imagination, or perhaps just the wind through the rafters. But now, after what's happened, I wonder if I should have spoken." Miss Marple's knitting bag rested at her side, her needles untouched. Yet her mind, quick as ever, had already begun weaving threads of connection. And outside, the church bell tolled the hour, as though marking the weight of his words. The morning broke with a soft veil of fog draped across St. Mary Mead, the kind of mist that muffled every sound and blurred every outline. It was the sort of weather that made one's breath appear ghostly in the air and lent even the most familiar of places a curious, dreamlike quality. Miss Marple, wrapped in a sensible grey shawl, made her way toward the old railway station with deliberate steps, her umbrella tapping lightly on the gravel path. Few villagers ventured out so early, and those who did moved quickly, eager to be indoors again with tea and toast. The station stood deserted, its timbers dark with damp, the rails glistening faintly in the half-light. Yet to Miss Marple's eye, the place seemed almost alive, as though holding on to whispers of all that had once passed through its doors. She paused at the platform, her gaze falling upon the toppled suitcase that still lay where it had been discovered. Others had seen nothing unusual in it, merely an abandoned belonging, perhaps discarded in haste. But Miss Marple bent closer, peering at the faint scuff marks in the wood beside it. They were irregular, as though the case had been dragged rather than dropped. Her eyes moved to the glove lying a few feet away. Many had remarked upon its presence, noting it as a curious detail but no more. To Miss Marple, however, gloves were deeply personal objects. A woman did not part with one so easily, nor leave it behind without cause. She noted the stitching, neat, firm, of good quality. The sort of glove, she thought, that belonged to someone who cared about appearances, even in small things. As she straightened, the mist thickened for a moment, and through it she caught the faintest outline of footprints leading toward the side gate. They were shallow, blurred by the damp air, but unmistakably recent. Most striking of all was their unevenness, one print deeper than the other, as though the walker favored one leg. Miss Marple's mind ticked gently over the detail. A limp, perhaps. She recalled one or two villagers who walked so, but she did not leap to conclusions. Observation first, conclusions later, that was her way. The distant whistle of a train echoed from far beyond the fields, a lonely, hollow sound that only deepened the stillness. Miss Marple turned slowly, her eyes drifting toward the waiting room. The door hung slightly ajar, though she distinctly remembered Constable Blake locking it the previous day. She pushed it open with her umbrella tip, stepping inside. The air was colder here, the dust unsettled. On the wooden bench rested a faint indentation, as though someone had sat there not long ago. A scrap of paper fluttered on the floorboards, half tucked beneath the bench. She stooped and retrieved it, smoothing the creases. It appeared to be the corner of a timetable, torn hastily from its hole. A faint pencil mark lingered against one departure, 7:15 to Paddington. "Curious," she murmured, slipping it into her pocket. Outside, the fog began to thin, and the village stirred to life. But Miss Marple remained still a moment longer, her mind weaving these delicate threads together, sensing the picture forming, though the pattern was not yet clear. If one wished to know the true pulse of St. Mary Mead, there were two certain places to linger, the grocer's shop and the vicarage. The grocer's offered chatter over apples and flour, but the vicarage supplied the deeper notes of speculation, cloaked, ever so gently, in the guise of Christian concern. That very afternoon, the vicarage drawing-room was alive with just such a blend of kindness and curiosity. The fire crackled merrily, and the air was thick with the aroma of Mrs. Clement's seed cake. A small gathering of ladies had assembled, teacups in hand, each voice carrying the lilt of someone who longed to be both charitable and correct. Mrs. Price Ridley, stout and forthright, leaned forward upon her chair. "Mark my words, Vicar, that station has always been a place for trouble. Why, only last winter I saw a tramp lurking there, and I told Mr. Sims at once that nothing good ever comes of abandoned buildings." Mrs. Clement, the vicar's gentle wife, gave a soothing smile. "Now, dear Mrs. Price Ridley, we mustn't let our imaginations run away with us. Perhaps the poor man was only seeking shelter." But Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed, unmoved by such reasoning. Shelter indeed. More like skulking about. And now a death. You'll see, it's all connected. At this, Miss Hartnell, tall and angular, set down her cup with deliberate care. "I heard," she began, lowering her voice though every ear strained to catch her words, "that a man was seen hurrying past the station the very evening before the body was discovered. Coat pulled tight, something hidden beneath it. Who can say what wickedness he was about?" Mrs. Clement gasped softly. "Oh, I do hope it isn't anyone from our parish." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting needles glinting in the firelight, allowed herself the faintest smile. She had been waiting for this very moment, the flow of gossip, each phrase a piece of embroidery, some true, some fanciful. The trick was to know which threads to pull. "Indeed," murmured the vicar, attempting to restore balance, "we must not leap to judgments. The police are handling the matter with great care." "Police!" scoffed Mrs. Price Ridley. "A great many uniforms, and not a thimbleful of sense between them. They look for the obvious and miss the rest. I dare say Miss Marple here could tell them a thing or two." All eyes turned to the elderly lady, who did not so much as falter in her knitting. "Well," she said mildly, "human nature is very much the same in every place. People often reveal more than they intend, if one only listens carefully." There was a pause, the ladies exchanging glances. They were fond of Miss Marple, though occasionally unsettled by her calm certainty. The conversation drifted on, from trains to timetables, to the curious business of who might have been travelling where. Yet, as the clock struck 4, Miss Marple tucked her knitting neatly into her bag. She had heard enough for the present. Behind the chatter lay a kernel of truth, and she intended to find it. The morning after the vicarage gathering dawned cold and bright, with a thin frost still clinging to the hedgerows. St. Mary Mead stirred as usual, milk delivered, chimneys smoking, and shopkeepers arranging their wares with brisk efficiency, but beneath the ordinary rhythm pulsed a subtle unease. The news of the railway station death had woven itself into every conversation, and all awaited the arrival of Scotland Yard. Inspector Graves did not disappoint. By noon, a motor car rolled into the village square, drawing a small cluster of curious onlookers who paused in their errands to stare. Out stepped a tall, spare man with a neatly brushed moustache and a trench coat buttoned smartly against the chill. He carried himself with the sort of quiet authority that brooked no nonsense, and yet his eyes revealed the gleam of a man accustomed to piecing together puzzles. He wasted little time. His first stop was, quite naturally, the vicarage. Mrs. Clement, all flutter and hospitality, ushered him inside with such eagerness that one might have supposed she had been expecting royalty. A tray of scones was produced at once, though Inspector Graves declined with a polite shake of his head. "I shall get straight to business," he said in a clipped tone, notebook poised. "The deceased gentleman has been identified as a Mr. Howard Drayton, formerly of London. A solicitor, semi-retired. I intend to establish what brought him to this village and why he was found, lifeless, at your abandoned station." Mrs. Price Ridley, who had taken it upon herself to hover nearby, interjected at once. "I said all along that that station was a den of trouble. No respectable person has set foot there for years. And a solicitor, you say? Well, they always know more than they ought, don't they?" Inspector Graves offered a thin smile. "Madam, speculation is precisely what hinders an investigation. Facts, however, will serve us well." His gaze swept the room with measured precision, lingering for a brief moment upon Miss Marple, seated quietly as ever with her knitting. He did not underestimate her. Few professional detectives ever did once they had heard her name. "Miss Marple, I trust you are aware of certain observations made by the villagers?" "Oh," she replied, her needles clicking gently, "one hears this and that, of course. Human nature does love a mystery. Though I dare say, Inspector, that people often speak most truly when they least imagine they are being listened to. Graves inclined his head, acknowledging her point without committing himself further. He proceeded to ask questions with brisk efficiency. Where had the villagers been the evening of the incident, who had passed along the high street, and whether anyone recalled seeing a man hurrying from the direction of the station? Each answer was scribbled neatly into his notebook, and each reply seemed to generate yet another line of inquiry. By the time he took his leave, the inspector had left behind more questions than answers. Yet Miss Marple, watching from the window as his motor-car disappeared down the lane, had already marked the significance of several small details the others had overlooked. The investigation was only just beginning, and she, quietly observant, was a step ahead. The following afternoon was damp and grey, with a fine mist drifting over the meadows and cloaking the rooftops of St. Mary Mead. It was the sort of day that encouraged the lighting of fires and the brewing of strong tea, and most of the villagers were content to remain indoors. Yet within the snug parlour of Mrs. Price Ridley's house, a small gathering of ladies had assembled, ostensibly to discuss parish matters, though in truth the mystery of the railway station occupied every tongue. Mrs. Price Ridley, presiding with her usual air of self-importance, declared firmly that she had always said the station was a place of ill omen. Miss Hartnell chimed in about strange footsteps heard by the porter years ago. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly by the fire, listening rather than speaking, her knitting needles clicking gently as though the wool itself might whisper secrets. It was then that Mr. Pritchard, the timid village postmaster, entered, having been invited to discuss a church subscription. He was a small, nervous man, perpetually dabbing at his spectacles and clearing his throat. The ladies barely noticed his arrival until, quite suddenly, he blurted out in a strangled voice, I must tell you all something. I can't keep it in any longer." The room fell silent at once, all eyes fixing upon him with sharp curiosity. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, momentarily robbed of speech, leaned forward eagerly. Mr. Pritchard wrung his hands. "It was I who was seen near the railway station that night." "Yes, me. I was carrying something under my coat, though I swear it was nothing to do with the poor gentleman's death." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes glittered triumphantly. "I knew it. I said someone from the village must be involved. What were you hiding, Mr. Pritchard?" The postmaster turned crimson. "Old ledgers, that's all. I had been keeping them in the disused office at the station. It's quiet there, and no one bothers about old papers. I was bringing them home because I feared they might be found by the wrong hands." "Found by whom?" Miss Hartnell asked suspiciously. Mr. Pritchard hesitated. "There have been strangers in the village of late. Men asking odd questions about the railway and its history. I did not want them rifling through private correspondence." The explanation sounded feeble, yet there was an earnestness about the man's manner that gave pause. Miss Marple glanced up from her knitting, her blue eyes very bright. "You were wise to admit it, Mr. Pritchard. Secrets, however innocent, have a way of growing into something larger when left untold. Still, you must see how curious it appears that you were near the station at the very time when poor Mr. Drayton met his end." Mr. Pritchard sank into a chair, quite defeated. "I know, Miss Marple. and if the inspector asks, I shall tell him the same. But I swear upon my honour, I am no murderer." The ladies exchanged whispers, the fire crackled, and outside the mist thickened. An innocent man, or merely a frightened one? Miss Marple, ever attentive, suspected there was more to Mr. Pritchard's confession than he himself yet understood. It was the following morning when a small but significant discovery altered the current of the entire investigation. The mist had lifted, leaving behind a pale autumn sun that shone weakly upon the village rooftops. Miss Marple, who had risen early as was her custom, decided to call upon young Emily Carter, the stationmaster's daughter, who often assisted her father in sorting through the neglected storerooms of the old railway office. Emily greeted her visitor with a mixture of curiosity and respect. She was a bright-eyed girl of 19, with ink-stained fingers from her fondness for writing letters to cousins abroad. "You've come at the right moment, Miss Marple," she said breathlessly. "Father found a stack of old envelopes hidden behind a loose panel in the waiting-room wall. We were about to burn them, but I thought you might like to see them first." They sat together at the scrubbed wooden table, sunlight spilling across the pile of yellowed papers. Most were dull receipts and timetables long out of date. But one envelope, addressed in a bold hand and sealed with a faded crest, caught Miss Marple's eye. She turned it gently, noting how the paper crackled with age. "This one," she murmured, slipping it open with delicate care. Inside lay a single sheet, written in hurried scrawl. "Meet me at the station, midnight. Bring the documents. Do not fail me, or all will be lost." The signature, though smudged, was unmistakable. It belonged to Mr. Drayton, the unfortunate gentleman whose life had been so suddenly cut short. Emily's eyes widened. "Oh, Miss Marple, does that mean he arranged to meet someone here, the very night he died?" "It would appear so, my dear," Miss Marple replied softly. "But note how vague it is. No name given, no indication of what documents are meant. And yet, such vagueness is often deliberate. Whoever received this letter would know very well what was intended." Emily frowned. But if it was hidden, perhaps the other person never came at all. Miss Marple tapped her needles thoughtfully against her bag. Or perhaps they did, and had no wish for others to know. By the time Inspector Graves was summoned, the letter had been carefully placed in an evidence envelope. The inspector, though practical and rather unimaginative, could not conceal a flicker of excitement. At last, a concrete lead. This proves Drayton expected a meeting. The question is, with whom? Villagers speculated wildly as the news spread. Some whispered it must have been Mr. Pritchard, whose guilty conscience now seemed more suspicious. Others hinted at Mrs. Harcourt, who was known to have received mysterious correspondence herself. And a few, lowering their voices still further, wondered if the elusive strangers Mr. Pritchard had mentioned were at the heart of it all. Miss Marple, however, remained calm. She sipped her tea quietly that evening, reflecting on how the smallest scraps of paper often held the largest truths. A single letter could unravel a tapestry of secrets, provided one knew how to read between its lines. And as the church clock struck 6, she found herself wondering, had the murderer hidden the letter carelessly, or left it behind on purpose? The days following the discovery of the letter were marked by a subtle but unmistakable change in the air of St. Mary Mead. It was as though the village, usually so placid and predictable, had become a stage upon which each villager performed with added suspicion. Where once there had been cheerful greetings and gossip about the weather, there now lingered watchful pauses, lowered voices, and sidelong glances. At the grocer's, Mrs. Harcourt was seen purchasing far more sugar than usual, which immediately set tongues wagging. "She's expecting company," muttered Mrs. Price Ridley darkly to her companion. "And mark my words, it shan't be the sort of company that comes for tea and crumpets." Others whispered that she had been spotted near the old railway station late one evening, her shawl pulled tightly about her shoulders. Whether she was meeting someone, or simply walking off her nerves, was left to interpretation. Meanwhile, poor Mr. Pritchard found himself the subject of many a speculative remark. His nervous manner, once attributed to his shy temperament, now appeared to many as the telltale sign of a guilty conscience. At the post office, he dropped his letters with such haste that the postmistress nearly scolded him. "If he's nothing to hide," one villager remarked, "why does he look like a rabbit caught in the lantern light?" The discovery of the letter had been all anyone could talk about at the church social. Cups of weak tea were sipped over mutterings of midnight meetings and secret documents. It seemed no one could resist the temptation to place themselves as the cleverest observer, hinting that they had long suspected some clandestine dealings. Even the vicar, who usually discouraged idle chatter, found himself drawn into the speculation. "It is curious," he admitted gravely, "that such a missive should be concealed. Secrets are rarely innocent." Miss Marple, of course, listened with quiet amusement. She had always found that gossip, while often inaccurate, contained within it a seed of truth if one knew where to look. She noted who was most eager to accuse, who sought to deflect attention, and who remained strangely silent. Patterns emerged, as they always did, in the small details others dismissed. Yet the tension was undeniable. Neighbours who once exchanged produce over hedges now did so with cool civility. Curtains twitched more often, doors were closed a little faster, and the usual peace of the village green seemed overshadowed by suspicion. Even the children, sensing their elders' unease, played more quietly, their games lacking their usual cheer. And then, just as the mood reached its height, another unsettling incident occurred. Lantern light was seen flickering near the railway station well past midnight. A figure, indistinct in the fog, was glimpsed moving quickly along the platform, pausing as though searching for something before vanishing into the darkness. By morning, the village was alive with new theories. Someone was returning to the scene of the crime. But who, and why, remained a mystery. While the village buzzed with conjecture, Miss Marple sat in her familiar armchair, knitting needles clicking softly in the quiet of her sitting room. To anyone passing by the window, she seemed the very picture of harmless domesticity. Yet behind her gentle eyes, thoughts were weaving themselves together with far more precision than her woolen stitches. She had observed, as she always did, what others missed in their eagerness to talk. The letter, with its cryptic reference to a meeting, was not simply a clue, it was a thread, leading back through weeks of whispers and subtle behaviours. She recalled Mrs. Harcourt's sudden interest in the old railway station, Mr. Pritchard's nervous haste, and the faint smell of smoke on Mr. Graves's jacket one morning after he claimed to have been mending the boiler. Individually, these might have been dismissed, but together they painted a curious pattern. Miss Marple believed firmly that human nature was much the same everywhere, whether in London drawing-rooms or quiet country lanes. People lied for the same reasons: greed, love, fear, or vanity. One need only look for the smallest inconsistencies, for it was in those that the truth always lurked. She remembered distinctly that Mrs. Harcourt, when pressed about her whereabouts on the night of the discovery, had spoken of visiting her cousin. Yet Miss Marple knew her cousin lived nearly 30 miles away and could not possibly have been reached and returned from so swiftly. A small slip, but significant. And then there was Mr. Pritchard's letter, addressed in a hand far firmer than his own trembling script. Had he been acting as a messenger, passing along correspondence not truly his? But perhaps most telling of all was the lantern light at the railway station. The villagers assumed it must belong to one of their number, creeping about at night. Miss Marple, however, considered another possibility. What if it was someone from outside, someone using the station as a rendezvous point? In that case, the letter was not merely a message, but an instruction, an arrangement meant to be secret until fate intervened. Hello, my dear friends. My name is Jane, and tonight I'm delighted to welcome you to another mystery. This one is titled Death at the Old Railway Station. Picture a crisp autumn evening in the village, the leaves drifting outside while we sit together by the fire, a pot of tea steaming on the table. It's the perfect setting for secrets and whispers. Now, I wonder, have you ever walked past an old station and felt it held a story of its own? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's step quietly into the mystery together. The evening had drawn its veil of crisp autumn air over St. Mary Mead, that most unassuming of English villages. Golden lamplight glowed softly from cottage windows, spilling across cobbled lanes where the hush of fallen leaves whispered beneath careful steps. Church bells, distant and mellow, marked the hour with reassuring dignity. And yet, beneath this calm surface, a subtle suspense lingered, as though the night itself held its breath. Beyond the village green lay the old railway station, long abandoned, ivy-clad, and avoided by most. There, a lone figure hurried past, something bulky hidden beneath his coat. Inside her neat little cottage at the end of the lane, Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly by the crackling fire. The flames danced against the polished grate, sending golden flickers across her bookshelves and the framed samplers that lined her sitting room. She had her knitting needles in hand, though her mind, as so often, was far from idle. Outside, the village lay hushed in the cool embrace of autumn, yet within, the room carried a snug tranquillity, the faint tick of the clock, the scent of wood smoke, and the occasional pop of a log surrendering to the fire. It was at such moments, when St. Mary Mead seemed most serene, that curious events had a way of intruding. Indeed, Miss Marple often reflected that human nature rarely kept still for long, even in the quietest of parishes. And as if summoned by that very thought, a brisk knock sounded upon her door. "Good evening, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Price Ridley, bustling in without waiting for invitation, cheeks pink from the chill. She removed her gloves with unnecessary drama and lowered herself into the nearest chair. "I do hope I don't intrude, but I thought you ought to know. Something's afoot near the old railway station." Miss Marple set her knitting aside with a gentle smile. "The station, dear? That's not a place one often hears about these days." Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward, her eyes alight with the relish of village gossip. "I was passing there not half an hour ago, taking a short cut, you know, and I'm certain I heard a scream. A dreadful sound it was, sharp and sudden, and not the sort of thing one mistakes." Miss Marple, ever composed, merely nodded. She poured her guest a cup of tea from the pot already warming at her side. "People do sometimes imagine things, especially in the dusk. But then, one must always allow for the possibility that they do not." Encouraged, Mrs. Price Ridley went on, her voice hushed though no one else was near. "And I could swear I saw a man slip through the trees. A stranger, not one of ours, carrying something close to his chest. It put me quite out of spirits." The old lady's sharp blue eyes rested kindly on her visitor, yet behind them her thoughts worked swiftly, drawing delicate threads together. A scream. A stranger. The station. These were not ordinary matters, however much they might later be dismissed as fancy. "You did quite right to mention it," she said at last. "The smallest details can prove most revealing. One never knows, after all, how seemingly trifling things may connect." Mrs. Price Ridley sipped her tea, clearly reassured. The fire crackled on, but the stillness of the room felt subtly altered, as if carrying the echo of unseen footsteps. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. Outside, the night deepened, and somewhere beyond the village green, the shadows near the station seemed to grow darker still. Morning in St. Mary Mead always arrived with a certain unhurried dignity, as though the village itself disliked being roused too abruptly. A faint mist lingered in the hedgerows, dissolving as the first rays of sunlight touched the rooftops. The baker's shop was already alive with the warm scent of fresh loaves, and the bell above the post office door jingled as the earliest patrons collected their letters. Somewhere, a cockerel crowed rather belatedly, as if embarrassed to have overslept. Miss Marple stepped out into the crisp air, a small basket on her arm, intending to purchase milk and perhaps a seed cake should there be any left at the bakery. She paused a moment to admire the blaze of autumn colours along the lane, russet leaves drifting gently to the ground, their quiet rustle mingling with the distant sound of a milk cart. St. Mary Mead looked as charming as a painted postcard, every cottage neat, every garden carefully tended. Yet beneath the picture-book prettiness lay a subtle murmur of disquiet. Neighbours stood in twos and threes at gates and doorsteps, their voices lowered yet tinged with urgency. Miss Marple, with her accustomed unobtrusiveness, caught fragments of talk as she passed. "They say someone screamed." "A figure hurrying past in the dark." "And at the old station, of all places, why there?" The station itself, long closed and given over to ivy and bramble, was rarely mentioned in village gossip. It stood at the edge of the parish like a forgotten relic, its windows blank and its once busy platform now a haunt of pigeons. That it should suddenly become the subject of chatter lent the morning a curious, unsettled air. At the bakery, Miss Marple received her loaf wrapped in brown paper from young Mr. Lisson, who looked unusually animated. "Strange goings, and, miss," he confided, lowering his voice. "My cousin swears he saw a light moving in the station-house late last night. Lantern-like," he said. "But who'd be there? No one has reason." Miss Marple gave a mild smile, the kind that invited more without betraying too much of her own thoughts. "Perhaps a trick of the eyes," she suggested gently, though inwardly she filed the remark alongside Mrs. Price Ridley's tale of the scream and the stranger. Lanterns, after all, did not appear of their own accord. The village postmistress, encountered just outside, was equally brimming with news. "A letter's gone missing, or so Mrs. Finch insists," she said indignantly. "She swears she posted it, yet her sister never received it. I shouldn't wonder if these odd happenings are all of a piece. There's mischief about, you mark my words." Miss Marple merely nodded, her expression polite, but her mind ticked quietly onward. Letters mislaid, lights where none should be, whispers of strangers. Each might be no more than coincidence, but in her long experience, coincidences rarely remained so for long. And then, carried faintly on the morning air, came the shrill, unmistakable sound of a railway whistle. Miss Marple froze for a fraction of a second, though no one else seemed to notice. The station had been closed for years. No train had passed that way in a decade or more. Yet the echo lingered, sharp and disquieting, as though the village itself had heard a ghost. The old railway station lay in its customary hush, its once busy platform choked with weeds and ivy curling thickly around rusting rails. It was the sort of place children both feared and adored, fearful in its shadows, yet irresistible in its promise of hidden adventures. That morning, two village boys, Peter and Geoffrey, set out to test their courage, as boys so often do. Armed with sticks and boundless curiosity, they crept past the no trespassing sign that had long since lost its authority. "Bet you won't climb the signal post," Geoffrey dared, his breath puffing white in the cool air. Peter, determined not to appear cowardly, strode ahead towards the platform. Yet before he could issue his retort, he stumbled, his stick clattering to the ground. There, half concealed by a tangle of ivy and fallen timbers, lay the unmistakable form of a man. For a moment the boys froze, their bravado dissolving like morning mist. The figure was strangely still, one arm crooked unnaturally, the face turned away. A hat lay discarded a few feet off, and in the man's clenched hand was a scrap of paper, its edges torn and muddied. Peter swallowed hard. "Geoffrey, he's not moving." Their voices, thin and trembling, carried across the empty station. Suddenly the thrill of daring seemed foolish, and the adventure turned dreadful. Without another word, the boys bolted back along the path, shouting for help with every ounce of breath. She paused in her knitting, the click of the needles ceasing for a moment as the fire crackled in the grate. "Yes," she thought, "it is coming together. One must only be patient, as with a difficult stitch. Tug too quickly, and the whole row unravels. Work steadily, and the pattern reveals itself." Later that afternoon, she took a quiet walk through the village, appearing to admire the chrysanthemums blooming in gardens, yet all the while noting expressions, tones of voice, and who avoided meeting her gaze. She returned home with a faint, knowing smile. The pieces were nearly in place. One final observation, she felt, would be enough to draw the picture clearly. And once she had it, she would know not only who held the secret of the railway station, but why someone had risked so much to conceal it. The vicarage drawing-room was warmer than usual that evening, a small fire flickering in the grate and casting soft shadows on the chintz curtains. Villagers had gathered, their faces taut with curiosity, apprehension, and no small degree of weariness. Rumours had twisted themselves into knots, and now everyone longed for answers. At the centre sat Miss Marple, quite unassuming in her neat cardigan and sensible hat. She folded her hands lightly in her lap, as though she were about to remark upon the weather. Instead, she began in her quiet, deliberate way. "I dare say," she said, with that mild smile which concealed so much, "that the matter is not nearly so complicated as it first appeared. Human beings rarely act without reason. The trick is in seeing what sort of reason they have chosen to disguise." A hush fell over the room. Mrs. Harcourt shifted in her chair, her gloved fingers tapping nervously against her teacup. Mr. Pritchard, pale and sweating, dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. Even the vicar's wife leaned forward, her embroidery forgotten in her lap. Miss Marple continued, her tone almost conversational. "We had, of course, the abandoned railway station, such a convenient place for secret meetings. It was assumed that only villagers would use it, but I felt that assumption was our first mistake. One should always ask, who else might benefit from a quiet, deserted platform?" The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with implication. "Then there was the letter," she went on. "Written, curiously, not in Mr. Pritchard's hand, though it was found amongst his things. That suggested to me that he was not the author, but the courier. A reluctant one, perhaps, forced into it through some knowledge another held over him." Mr. Pritchard let out a strangled sound, half protest, half admission, before sinking back into his chair. "And Mrs. Harcourt," Miss Marple said gently, turning her eyes upon the woman, "your tale of visiting your cousin was most ingenious, but alas, geography does not bend so kindly. I made a few discreet inquiries. Your cousin had not seen you in several months." Gasps fluttered about the room like startled birds. Mrs. Harcourt flushed deeply, clutching at her pearls. Miss Marple's needles clicked once in her lap, though she was not knitting now, merely holding them. "You see, the meeting at the station was never about mere village gossip. It was about something hidden, something worth a great deal. But as always happens, secrets have a way of becoming heavier than their keepers can bear." The fire gave a sudden crack, making Mrs. Price jump. Miss Marple leaned back, her voice still mild, yet certain. "And so it becomes clear who was at the station that night, and why. One wished to conceal the truth, another to reveal it, and in the struggle between the two, a most unfortunate consequence occurred." The room was utterly still, the truth trembling on the verge of being named. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the vicarage clock, marking each second as though it too were waiting for Miss Marple's conclusion. The faces around her glowed in the firelight, expectant, fearful, and hungry for certainty. Miss Marple, with a calmness that belonged more to a tea party than to the unmasking of a crime, adjusted her spectacles and spoke. "The truth, I am afraid, lies closer to home than many of you wish to believe. It was you, Mrs. Harcourt, who arranged the meeting at the railway station. You sought to retrieve the papers your husband had hidden, fearing they would expose dealings better left in the dark. When Mr. Pritchard stumbled across your little plan, you enlisted his silence with threats of past misdeeds. But secrecy breeds desperation, and desperation leads to mistakes." Mrs. Harcourt's lips parted in denial, but no sound came. The villagers watched as her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of exposure. Miss Marple's voice remained steady, almost sympathetic. "You never meant for violence. That, I do believe. But when your husband caught you at the station, when harsh words were exchanged, a struggle ensued. He fell upon the edge of the platform, an accident, perhaps, but one you chose to disguise. And in covering it up, you made yourself guilty of far more than carelessness." A murmur ran through the room, sorrow mixed with shock. The vicar's wife pressed a hand to her mouth, and Mr. Pritchard buried his face in his hands. Mrs. Harcourt, trembling now, whispered, "I only wished to protect my name, to keep the village from knowing." "Ah," Miss Marple said gently, "but secrets are like weeds in a garden. They have a way of forcing themselves into the light, no matter how carefully one tends the soil." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the fire. At last, the constable stepped forward, laying a firm but not unkind hand upon Mrs. Harcourt's arm. There was no dramatic outburst, no scene of resistance. Only the quiet, resigned footsteps of a woman who had lived too long beneath the shadow of her own fears. When the vicarage door closed behind them, the room seemed to exhale. Teacups were lifted, chairs scraped against the floor, and life's small, ordinary comforts returned. Miss Marple, however, remained by the fire, her needles clicking softly once more. She looked up only when the vicar's wife approached, eyes full of gratitude. "You saw it all, when the rest of us saw nothing," she said. Miss Marple gave a modest smile. "It is simply a matter of watching people. They tell you everything, if only you know what to notice." Outside, the church bells began their evening chime, a sound of peace after days of unease. The villagers would gossip, of course, they always did, but already the sharp edges of fear were softening into story. And Miss Marple, content with her knitting and her cup of tea, allowed herself the smallest sigh of satisfaction. Justice, after all, had been quietly served in St. Mary Mead once again. And so our tale of murder at the winter fair draws quietly to a close. If you've stayed with us to the very end, do know how dearly I thank you. It is the truest kindness. I should love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Every little reflection is most welcome. A gentle tap of the like button is always a comfort to us, and if you subscribe, you shall never miss the next cozy mystery waiting just around the village green.